Imagine Jesus is hanging on the cross in so much pain, and then he suddenly cries out, "My God, why have you abandoned me?" If you heard that, you might think, wait, did God really leave Jesus, his own son, when he needed him the most? Thinking that God might turn his back on us when we're in trouble. But what if I told you that's not what really happened? What if God never left Jesus, not even for a second? Many people think that God turned away from Jesus on the cross because of all the sin he was carrying. They imagine that God couldn't handle the weight of the world's sin and left Jesus alone. So, where was God while Jesus was suffering on the cross? God didn't leave Jesus, and he was actually doing something incredible during those painful moments. There's more going on here than meets the eye, and it all ties back to God's plan to save everyone, including you and me. To understand this, we must examine what Jesus said and its meaning. Trust me, the answer might surprise you. Many people think that because Jesus was carrying the weight of all humanity's sins, God had to turn away. It feels like a natural conclusion when you hear Jesus cry out, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Matthew 27:46. But this interpretation is actually based on a misunderstanding of both Jesus' words and the nature of God. Let's unpack this carefully. First, let's look at the words Jesus used. He wasn't just expressing a personal feeling of being left behind, he was quoting a well-known psalm, Psalm 22, written hundreds of years earlier by King David. Back then, the Psalms were like songs or prayers everyone knew, so when Jesus quoted the first line, my God, why have you forsaken me?" he was referencing the entire psalm, not just that single sentence. If you read through Psalm 22, it begins with feelings of abandonment but ends in hope, with a declaration that God has never truly forsaken his people. People who were well-versed in the scriptures surrounded Jesus. By quoting Psalm 22, he wasn't saying, "God has left me." He was actually pointing them toward the fulfillment of prophecy. He also describes specific details of the crucifixion, such as the piercing of hands and feet and the casting of lots for clothing, Psalm 22:16-18. The Jewish people saw these as clear indications that God's divine plan, which had begun long before this moment, included Jesus' suffering. This leads to a powerful conclusion. God was present, not absent, during Jesus' suffering. In fact, his presence was even more profound during this time because he was reconciling the world to himself through Jesus, 2 Corinthians 5:19. The entire purpose of Jesus' death was to bring humanity back into a relationship with God. Jesus was not separating from his Father. Rather, he was fulfilling his Father's will, which encompassed providing redemption to the world. We also know from the Gospel of John that Jesus was fully aware of the Father's constant presence throughout his ministry. Jesus said, "I am in the Father, and the Father is in me." John 14:10, and this connection did not break even on the cross. This makes it clear that God never abandoned Jesus. What was happening was not a separation, but a deep act of love. It's important to remember that, according to Christian teachings, God is omnipresent, meaning he is everywhere at all times. There's no place where God cannot be. So, the idea that he would leave Jesus during the crucifixion contradicts the very nature of God. If God is everywhere, then he was certainly with Jesus on the cross, even if it didn't look that way to the people around him. To reinforce this point, look at Colossians 1:17. In him all things hold together. This means that even in the darkest moments, God is holding the universe and us together. He was with Jesus in his suffering, and through that suffering, he was bringing hope to the world. One of the biggest reasons people misunderstand what happened on the cross is because of how they interpret certain Bible verses. People often believe that sin is so terrible that it completely separates God and humanity, and they often use this belief to explain why Jesus might have felt abandoned during his crucifixion. But let's break down this idea more carefully and take a closer look at the scriptures, often misinterpreted. One of the verses frequently cited is Habakkuk 1:13, where the prophet says, Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. At first glance, it sounds like God can't even look at sin, right? But if we dig deeper, we see that this was part of a conversation. Habakkuk was speaking to God, expressing confusion over why God allows evil to exist in the world. He wasn't saying that God literally can't look at sin, but instead was questioning how a holy God could allow injustice. In other words, this verse isn't about God turning away from sin. It's more about a man wrestling with the idea that God sees everything and yet sometimes seems to tolerate evil in the world. This verse is not proof that God separated himself from Jesus on the cross. In fact, God has always been deeply involved with humanity, even when sin is present. Another passage often misunderstood is Isaiah 59:2, which says, "Your iniquities have separated you from your God, your sins have hidden his face from you." People commonly use this verse to argue that sin creates a wall between us and God. But again, context is key. The prophet Isaiah wasn't saying that sin makes it impossible for God to be present. He was warning the people of Israel about the consequences of their continual disobedience. Their sin had damaged their relationship with God, but God was always still there, waiting for them to return to him. We know from other scriptures that God doesn't abandon people because of their sins. Take the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3:1. After they sinned, they felt ashamed and tried to hide from God. But did God leave them? No, he went looking for them in the garden, asking, "Where are you?" Genesis 3:9. This shows us that even when we mess up, God comes after us. He doesn't turn away. So how does all of this connect to Jesus on the cross? If we interpret those verses too literally, we might think that sin actually has the power to separate us from God. But that's not the message the Bible gives. In fact, the Bible consistently shows that God is always reaching out to people, even in their sin. The rest of Psalm 22 describes a situation that looks hopeless on the outside, but it ends with praise, acknowledging that God has been there all along. Jesus was pointing those who heard him to the bigger story, the story of God's plan to save the world through him. He was showing them that even in suffering, God is present and working. This leads to another important concept, God's omnipresence. God is present everywhere, all the time. There is no place where he is not. Psalm 139, 7-8 tells us, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go to heaven or make my bed in the depths, you are there." If God is always present, then even in the darkest moments, like the crucifixion, he was still right there with Jesus. So to believe that God turned away from Jesus would be to misunderstand both the nature of God and the purpose of Jesus' death. Instead of being a moment of separation, the cross was the ultimate demonstration of God's closeness to humanity. Jesus took on the weight of sin, not to show that God leaves us in our worst moments, but to prove that God's love is so strong that it overcomes even the greatest darkness. God's incredible grace and forgiveness. These two concepts, grace and forgiveness, are the foundation of the Christian faith, and they come to life most powerfully in Jesus' death and resurrection. To begin, we need to understand that grace means undeserved favor. It's when God gives us something wonderful, even though we haven't earned it. Imagine getting the best gift ever, not because you did anything to deserve it, but simply because someone loves you that much. That's what God's grace is all about. When Jesus went to the cross, he wasn't just suffering for no reason. He was there for a purpose that would change everything for humanity. You see, before Jesus, people tried to follow strict laws to stay right with God. But no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't live up to those standards. They kept failing, and in those failures, sin kept separating people from God's best for them. But here's where grace comes in. Romans 5:8 tells us God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Jesus didn't wait for us to get our act together. He didn't wait for us to be perfect. Instead, while we were still making mistakes and struggling with our flaws, he offered his life for us. That's grace, offered freely, not because of anything we've done, but because of who God is. Now, what does this mean for forgiveness? It means that through Jesus' death, God offers us complete forgiveness. What Jesus did on the cross has wiped clean every wrong thing we've ever done, every lie, every hurtful action, and every failure. In Ephesians 1:7, it says, "In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, in accordance with the riches of God's grace. We no longer count our sins against us because of Jesus. Instead, we are free." But this isn't just about forgiveness for the things we've done in the past. It's about the future too. Jesus' sacrifice opened up a whole new way for us to live. We don't have to live in fear or guilt anymore. We don't have to wonder if we've done enough to make God love us. Through grace, we have a constant, unshakable assurance that God's love and forgiveness are always available to us. This is where the story of the prodigal son fits in beautifully. In Luke 15, Jesus tells a parable about a young man who demands his inheritance from his father, leaves home, and wastes all of it on reckless living. When he's hit rock bottom, he decides to return home, not expecting much. Maybe his father would at least let him be a servant. But what happens? His father sees him from far away, runs to him, and welcomes him back with open arms. He throws a huge celebration, not because the son deserved it, but because of the Father's love and grace. This is exactly how God treats us. No matter how far we've strayed, no matter how many mistakes we've made, God is always ready to welcome us back. He doesn't hold our failures over us. Instead, he offers forgiveness and grace, just like the father in the story. And it's not just a one-time offer, it's constant. Every day, God's grace is new. Every day, he invites us to come back to him, no matter what. Another important part of grace is that it's transformative. When we experience God's grace and forgiveness, it changes us. We no longer live under the weight of guilt and shame. Instead, we experience freedom, fully aware of God's profound love for us. We share this love with others, not keeping it to ourselves. Just as we've been forgiven, we're called to forgive others. Just as we've been shown grace, we're invited to extend that same grace to the people around us. Romans 5:20 says, "Where sin increased, grace increased all the more." This means that no matter how big our mistakes, God's grace is bigger. There's nothing we can do that is beyond the reach of his forgiveness. That's the beauty of the cross. Jesus didn't just die to cover a few mistakes. He died to cover everything, for everyone, forever. If this message are touching your heart and opened your eyes to the incredible love and grace God has for you, consider supporting this content by giving a super thanks. By doing so, you're helping us continue sharing these powerful truths, spreading hope, and reaching more people who need to hear about God's never-ending love. God didn't turn his back on Jesus, and he will never turn his back on us. Through the cross, he demonstrated that even in the darkest moments, he is fully present, working out his plan for redemption. The cry from the cross wasn't a sign of God leaving. It was the fulfillment of an ancient promise, a prophecy that told of suffering, but also of hope, victory, and restoration. Jesus' suffering was not in vain. It was the key to unlocking grace for all of humanity. No matter what we're going through, no matter how distant we may feel from God, he's still with us. We've seen through Scripture that God's presence is constant. From the very beginning, he has sought us out, even when we've made mistakes, just like he did with Adam and Eve. And through Jesus, he has shown that nothing, not even sin or death, can separate us from his love. It's about the grace and forgiveness he offers freely to each of us. Jesus' death wasn't just a historical event, it was an act of love that continues to impact our lives today. It was God's way of saying, "I love you more than your mistakes. I love you so much, I'll take on your burden so you can be free." Grace is the freedom to live without the fear of abandonment, knowing that God's love encompasses everything, no matter how big or small. If God didn't abandon Jesus during his most painful hour, why would he ever abandon us? The answer is simple: he wouldn't, and he won't. No matter how far you feel from him, he's always reaching out, ready to bring you closer, just like the father in the story of the prodigal son. That father didn't just welcome his lost son home. He ran to meet him. That's the picture of God's love for you, a love that never gives up, never lets go, and always welcomes you back. God is never far away. Even in the moments when you feel alone or overwhelmed, He's right there, offering grace and forgiveness. He sees you, He loves you, and He's ready to guide you through whatever challenges you face. And just as Jesus declared from the cross, "It is finished," you can rest in the assurance that everything has been completed for you. His grace is enough. This is the lasting message of the cross. God's love never leaves, and His grace never runs out. And that's something worth holding on to, no matter where life takes you. Thanks for watching. Join our community by subscribing to this channel. Until the next video.